Lecture 55, Voltaire.
We move now from Jonathan Swift, whose satire leaves us with very little hope for the possibility of any kind of progress for the human race, towards a French philosopher and poet whose work might usefully be compared with that of Alexander Pope. It is both satiric and yet contains a kind of optimism, a kind of hope that things might in fact improve. The French philosopher, poet, novelist, playwright, and frequent satirist of political and religious authorities, Voltaire insisted that the task of the intellectual must be to écraser l'infâme, crush infamy. For Voltaire, infamy consisted of all forms of intolerance, and despite imprisonment and exile, he spent much of his life resisting the tyranny of religious and political repression. No single work or collection of texts can do justice to the range of Voltaire's literary and philosophical achievements, or to the manner in which his endless social commentary in his letters, pamphlets, satiric dialogues, and tales helped to shape the central ideas of the Enlightenment. In this lecture, we will use one text, Candide or the Optimist, published in 1759, to demonstrate the particular combination of wit, satire, and narrative skill that Voltaire employed to expose those self-deceiving dogmas, like the formal philosophy of optimism, that protect us from the knowledge of evil, especially of the evil that is the product of human cruelty and complacency, a complacency exercised in the refusal to make a choice for the good. Let me first speak briefly of Voltaire's life. Voltaire was the son of a minor bureaucrat, and he grew up in a bourgeois milieu at the time when the middle class saw a dramatic increase in wealth and influence in French society. He was educated by the Jesuits, and like so many sons of the middle class, took up the practice of law. His career in law did not last long, however, and he soon abandoned it for literature. His satiric verses about the aristocracy, particularly the Prince Regent, soon put him on the wrong side of the law, and he spent 11 months in the Bastille when he was in his early 20s. His imprisonment did not deter him from either a literary career or from continuing to write and publish works critical of social injustice and political inequality. Although his business speculations made him a rich man by the time he was in his early 30s, his wealth did not protect him from further imprisonment. Finally, in 1726, Voltaire left France and spent 3 years in exile, mostly in England. His philosophical letters, originally called the English Letters, which were published in 1734, were the result of this time in England. The letters, ostensibly the work of an imaginary French visitor to England writing home, praise English religious tolerance and pragmatism, and also discuss English literature and the work of Newton and Locke. Their publication, like so much of Voltaire's work, upset the authorities, and the printer was imprisoned and the work publicly burned. Upon the publication of the philosophical letters, Voltaire was condemned by the Parliament of Paris as offensive to politics and religion. When he returned to France, Voltaire spent the next 15 years living on the estate of his wealthy patron and mistress, studying and writing extensively. After her death in 1749, Voltaire lived at the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia until 1752. And only when he was in his late 50s did Voltaire finally purchase property of his own outside Geneva, the birth city of another great philosopher of the Enlightenment, Rousseau, whom we will study, in Lecture 56. Voltaire spent the last 20 years of his life in Geneva at his estate, where he wrote essays, participated in politics, and corresponded with royalty, philosophers, and actors. In the last year of his life, 1778, Voltaire, now famous throughout Europe as a social critic and writer, returned to Paris in triumph, but died 3 months later. Like Molière, he was denied burial in consecrated ground, and his body was smuggled out of Paris. In 1791, however, his remains were returned to Paris, and in an elaborate funeral procession organized by the French revolutionary artist David, he was carried to the Pantheon. When the Bourbons returned to power, however, the remains of both Voltaire and Rousseau, who had also been elevated, neither of whom had been overly friendly to the Bourbons' reign, were removed from the Pantheon, carried in a sack to the outskirts of the city, and dumped into a pit of quicklime. Let's now look at the work of Voltaire. Voltaire, along with Diderot and Rousseau, was one of the Enlightenment's preeminent philosophes, a group of 18th century French philosophers who believed in human perfectibility, religious tolerance, and deism. That is, the belief based on the light of nature and reason in the existence of a God or supreme being rather than the Christian God of revealed religion. With their progressive views, especially the concept of religious tolerance and rational inquiry, these writers inevitably challenged the political, religious, and philosophical establishment. Like his exact contemporary Samuel Johnson, whose work we will examine in this section, Voltaire's work spans across the spectrum of literary genres and styles, from drama to history, philosophy, and the encyclopedic form, a form particular to this age which believed that experience and the material world could be categorized and thus controlled through the intellect. Though Voltaire considered his best work to be his tragedies, he is remembered now mostly for his satirical works like Candide. Candide, published anonymously in 1759 and distributed illegally, enjoyed instant, though obviously covert, success, although those who were the object of this satire naturally condemned it as scandalous and indecent. The police were ordered to seize all copies of Candide that could be found, but the controversy only served to fuel the book's popularity, and by the end of the year, at least 17 editions of the work had been published. Religious officials pronounced the book full of dangerous principles concerning religion and tending to moral deprivation. Candide articulates the same kind of outrage we saw in the works of Swift against the capacity of man to brutalize his fellows, and Voltaire spares no one in his critique. He attacks the aristocratic, military, and religious power structures that work together to create a world of cruelty and inequality because it supports their own vices, greed, decadence, hypocrisy, and egotism. The satire works at the level of form as well as content. Voltaire's ridiculously artificial plots, repeated recognition scenes, impossible coincidences, people resurrected from the dead, mocks the gullibility of readers of fiction who mistake the imaginary for the real, unlike those readers who follow the philosophical route to enlightenment. Voltaire also parodies the limitations of classical form in Candide's epic but futile journey. Despite his parody of these narrative forms, Voltaire nevertheless suggests that we need some fictions, some way to protect ourselves against infamy, as well as needing to make some pattern out of what might otherwise seem random and arbitrary accidents and tragedies. Without the consolations of pattern and narrative, the black comedy of the misadventures of Candide and his companions is merely an empty mockery of the belief in a rational and just plan for the universe without providing any comfort. And although Voltaire does not offer much hope to the inhabitants of his fictional world, he is, I would suggest, considerably more optimistic about the future than the bitterly satiric view that Swift proposes in Gulliver's Travels and other works. Voltaire satirizes in particular the optimistic philosophy of Leibniz, who, like Alexander Pope, articulated a belief in a pre-established harmony in the world, the equivalent of Defoe's Christian Providence. Of course, for the purposes of satire, Voltaire reduces Leibniz's philosophy to an unfairly simplistic formula. Everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Neither Leibniz nor Pope would have denied the human capacity for cruelty and depravity, and indeed, Voltaire's satire is directed at the abuses of the philosophical position rather than at the philosophy itself, at the manner in which the philosophy becomes an excuse for indifference and compromise. The narrative of Candide follows the misadventures of Candide, Voltaire's naive hero whose name suggests both his directness, his honesty, he's candid, but also in its Latinate form means white, blank, as in a blank sheet of paper upon which anything can be written, a tabula rasa. Candide adheres steadfastly to the tenets of optimism as taught to him by his childhood mentor Pangloss. Pan, which means all, gloss, which means language or talk, is a metaphysicist who preaches Leibniz's optimistic philosophy of all is good in the world, despite all evidence to the contrary. Pangloss gave instruction in metaphysico, theological, cosmolunigology. He proved admirably that there cannot possibly be an effect without a cause, and that in this best of all possible worlds, the Baron's castle was the best of all castles, and his wife the best of all possible baronesses. It is clear, said he, that things cannot be otherwise than they are, for since everything is made to serve an end, everything necessarily serves the best end. Observe, noses were made to support spectacles, hence we have spectacles. Legs, as anyone can plainly see, were made to be breeched, so we have breeches. Stones were made to be shaped and build castles with, thus my lord has a fine castle. For the greatest baron in the province should have the finest house. And since pigs were made to be eaten, we eat pork all year round. Consequently, those who say everything is well are uttering mere stupidities. They should say everything is for the best. Pangloss is all talk and is incapable of judging reality, which is, on the evidence of what happens to him and Candide, pretty awful. Cunegonde, whose name is a pun upon a well-known four-letter Anglo-Saxon word for women's genitalia, is Candide's love interest, and his search for her drives the narrative. Cunegonde also begins as a student of Pangloss, but her life's hardships lead her to become ambivalent about his optimistic teachings, thus suggesting, as Molière does, that women's more pragmatic approach to reality might be, in the end, more productive than merely philosophizing about life. Midway through Candide's journeys, he meets Martin, who remains the hero's travel companion and valet throughout the rest of the story. Martin is a pessimist, a self-described Manichaean, that is, one who sees the universe as a battlefield between good and evil, and who predictably sees the world in the inverse of Pangloss. In the first half of Candide, the hero's journey is determined by chance and the ill or good will of others rather than by his own free will. In the second half, Candide actively pursues his own choices, although it does not seem to offer him any advantage in dealing with the world. In Chapter 1, Candide is chased from his native Westphalia, an earthly paradise, when his protector discovers his daughter, the Baroness Cunegonde, kissing Candide. Candide innocently believes that life at the Baron of Tunderden Trocken's chateau is the best of all possible worlds, as Pangloss has taught him, and thus he suffers the pain of being physically and spiritually exiled from what he believes to be paradise. Candide's education about the real nature of the world begins as soon as he leaves Westphalia, and he finds himself alternately fleeing violence or persecution and being saved by the goodness of strangers. In Chapter 2, for example, he is duped into joining the Bulgarian army, then flees when he experiences the atrocities of war, atrocities committed first by one side and then in revenge by the other, but all in accordance with law. When he flees to Holland, he escapes these horrors, and he is reunited with Dr. Pangloss, who is at first unrecognizable because he is suffering the ravages of syphilis. Taking a stroll around town, he met a beggar who was covered with pustules, his eyes were sunken, and the end of his nose rotted off. His mouth twisted, his teeth black, he had a croaking voice and a hacking cough, and he spat a tooth every time he tried to speak. Despite his condition, Pangloss insists that syphilis is a necessary ingredient, an indispensable part of the best of worlds, since his private misfortune generates the need for public welfare. Pangloss and Candide then travelled to Lisbon, just in time to be injured in the terrible earthquake that devastated the city in 1755. Pangloss appears to die at the hands of the Inquisition, while Candide narrowly escapes death, is reunited with Cunegonde, miraculously recovered from the rape and disemboweling committed on her body by Bulgarian soldiers. By chance, Candide kills her lover, the Grand Inquisitor, and then flees with her to the New World, where Candide once again loses Cunegonde, this time to a lascivious colonial governor in Buenos Aires. Candide once again escapes death by vengeful natives in Paraguay, and Candide's prudent travel companion, Cacambo, concludes what the naive hero cannot deduce for himself, that this hemisphere is no better than the other. Giving themselves over entirely to fate, Candide and Cacambo take a small boat down the river in Paraguay, where they discover the mythical city of El Dorado, where the streets are paved in gold, people are good-natured, healthy, and free of ambition, and everyone is equal and equally enlightened. However, despite their contentment in El Dorado, Candide and Cacambo resolve not to be happy any longer and decide to leave this paradise in order to find Cunegonde and secure her freedom from the governor by paying him with El Dorado rocks, precious gems. Once before, Candide left what he mistakenly thought of as paradise, the Baron's castle in Westphalia, although that was an unwilling departure. Here, where he is indeed in paradise, he chooses to leave. Is there something in Candide's nature in particular, or in mankind's nature in general, that would cause him to leave paradise? This is, after all, precisely what Pangloss has insisted is possible, the best of all worlds. Candide's departure from El Dorado suggests that even if Pangloss were right, even if there were a place where all was for the best in the best of all possible worlds, it is in man's nature to reject it and seek a more varied happiness, one that is more precious precisely because it is more uncertain. In the second half of the narrative, Candide decides his own fate by choosing an itinerary with the goal of finding Cunegonde. Returning to the real world from El Dorado, however, Candide's quest is thwarted and prolonged by all the predictable villainies of mankind already seen in the first half of the book, added to which Candide encounters the evils of colonialism in the form of a Negro slave who is missing his left leg and his right hand. When Candide inquires about the cause of the condition, the slave tells him, if we catch a finger in the sugar mill, they cut off your hand. If we try to run away, they cut off your leg. This, he says, is the price of the sugar that you eat in Europe. Despite his pity for the Negro, Candide's belief that even this injustice must serve a useful purpose makes him passive in the face of evil. This passivity also allows Candide to be swindled and cheated out of his money at every turn. The pessimist, Martin, joins Candide in his journeys and acts as a counterbalance to Candide's persistent optimism throughout so many disasters. Cunegonde, our hero's only hope of happiness, remains elusive until late in the narrative, when Candide and company rescue her and the old woman who has protected her from servitude in Constantinople. But she is, in this final of disillusionments, no longer as Candide remembers her. The tender lover Candide, seeing his lovely Cunegonde with her skin weathered, her eyes bloodshot, her breasts fallen, her cheeks seamed, her arms red and scaly, recoiled 3 steps in horror, and then advanced only out of politeness. This last disillusionment sabotages the entire narrative, for if Candide no longer loves Cunegonde, then the whole story has been pointless, and all the suffering has been for nothing. Is this indeed what life is all about? In the last chapter, Candide, Cunegonde, the old woman, Cacambo, Martin, and Pangloss settle together on a small plot of land in Turkey. When not arguing with each other, they inevitably encounter the last of human vices, boredom. I should like to know, says the old woman, which is worse, being raped 100 times by Negro pirates, having a buttock cut off, running the gauntlet in the Bulgar army, being flogged and hanged in an auto-da-fe, being dissected and rowing in the galleys, experiencing, in a word, all the miseries through which we have passed, or else just sitting here doing nothing. They are tempted to rejoin the fray of humanity, but consult some local elders first. A dervish tells them not to concern themselves with God's intentions. An old farmer tells them not to concern themselves with public affairs and just work their land, which will spare them from the 3 great evils, boredom, vice, and need. The 6 of them take this advice and cultivate their garden and find a certain degree of peace and happiness, if somewhat imperfect. Voltaire's tale is a masterly example of the conte philosophique, the philosophical tale, which is a hybrid of philosophy and fiction. The narrative structure relies on several popular genres for its shape: the morality or fairy tale, the travelogue, the romanesque or narrative in the style of medieval romance, and the picaresque, a narrative that recounts the adventures of the picaro, Spanish for a rogue or low-born adventurer, as he drifts from place to place and from one social milieu to another in his effort to survive. In its episodic structure, the picaresque novel resembles the medieval romance, to which it provided the first realistic counterpart. Unlike the idealistic knight-errant hero, however, the picaro is a cynical and amoral rascal who, if given half a chance, would rather live by his wits than by honourable work. Such a character allows the author to parody the society and its moral failures, which the picaro exploits. Voltaire parodies these forms, but also relies upon them to underscore the need for an alternative discourse to speak about evil. That is, he suggests that the traditional forms through which the philosopher speaks, the essay, the dialogue, are ineffective as a way of conveying the urgency of response that the contemporary world demands. There is a need for something more than intellectual philosophizing, which in its debased form Dr. Pangloss engages in, and which provides no solution to the problem of evil in the world. In fact, Pangloss's optimism is worse than the mere absence of a solution because it justifies passivity and indifference to cruelties in the world. Thus, like other defenses against evil, such as the Christian belief in the value of suffering and heavenly reward, or the romanticized violence of the medieval quest narrative, Pangloss's optimism does nothing to resist evil or change the world for the better. Voltaire insists upon the necessity for a general moral awakening to the reality of evil, the first step in which is to acknowledge its existence. This philosophical tale, then, is not interested in philosophizing about the cause of evil or its place in a larger divine scheme, but in the simple act of identifying it. Evil must be actively opposed. This serious subject matter is presented with irony and satire, and at times, despite the horrors being described, the tone is playful, light, and frivolous. Realism is abandoned for hyperbole to underscore the absurd extremity of vice in the world, although Voltaire includes several real events in the story. The execution of an admiral for not engaging the enemy aggressively enough, the deposition of 6 kings of their thrones, the massive loss of life in natural and man-made disasters. We might find the story of the woman whose buttock has been cut off to make a tasty rump steak for her companions ridiculous and therefore laughable, but why is that funny when the deformities enacted on the bodies of young girls in wartime are not? Or to put it another way, why is one unimaginable and therefore cause for humour, and the other imaginable but not the cause for immediate action? In the end, is there a difference between what we think others more brutal, more vicious, more barbaric than us are willing to do, and what we are willing to imagine and laugh at? The absence of realism extends to the depiction of characters. Candide is not a psychological drama. Like Molière's characters, the characters are stereotypes or functions of viewpoints, and therefore do not need to evolve. These stagnant characters emphasize the permanent, repetitious nature of violence in the world and are a means for Voltaire to criticize people for their stubbornness in thought and behavior, a stubbornness that he insists is of their own choosing. In other words, they could behave differently if they chose to. Voltaire wishes to engage with optimist philosophy in order to argue for the presence of free will in man. According to Voltaire, Leibniz asserts that God made only one world, the best of all possible worlds, which necessarily includes original sin. Leibniz thus sustains a central claim of the religious establishment, Jesuits in particular, that man is born evil and must depend on the Church for spiritual reform. Voltaire argues that man is born free to choose between good and evil. The many instances of vice and corruption encountered in the tale are not then part of God's master plan. Rather, these evils are the product of man's failure to choose good and to resist corruption. Voltaire underscores his argument for free will by showing that the natives in Paraguay, that is, natives in the New World and therefore, according to 18th century philosophy, in a state of nature, that these natives are capable of being both good or bad, depending on the circumstances. In El Dorado, a world that exists outside of both the New and Old World, in other words, a utopian space, Pangloss's philosophy might be valid, Candide suggests tentatively. This is probably the country where everything is for the best, for it's absolutely necessary that such a country should exist somewhere. And whatever Master Pangloss said of the matter, I have often had occasion to notice that things went very badly in Westphalia. Philosophically, of course, he is right. In the abstract, such a place does exist. But it is an impossibility, an illusion, a place that exists nowhere in the real world, whereas Westphalia, where things went very badly, does exist. Voltaire blames people's lack of will for society's persistent corruption and complacency. He takes particular aim at certain philosophers for being rigidly ideological. "I am still of my first opinion," replied Pangloss, "for after all I am a philosopher, and it would not be right for me to recant, since Leibniz could not possibly be wrong." The overwhelming evidence in Candide is that people are corrupt, even if they were not born that way. This is a very pessimistic view of the world, but even Martin, the pessimist, admits that it is always good to have hope. This narrative offers the only hope for happiness in a largely corrupt world through the exercise of a collective free will, that is, cultivating our garden or creating a greater social good. Free will will also allow people to change and evolve if they so choose. Remarkably, it is Candide, who typically does not assert his own ideas, who counters Martin's argument that mankind and animals are instinctual and alike in their inability to change. "Do you believe," asked Candide, "that men have always massacred one another as they do today? That they have always been liars, backbiters, gluttons, drunkards, misers, climbers, killers, calumniators, sensualists, fanatics, hypocrites, and fools?" "Do you believe," said Martin, "that hawks have always eaten pigeons when they could get them?" "Of course," said Candide. "Well," said Martin, "if hawks have always had the same characters, why do you suppose men have changed?" "Oh," said Candide, "there's a great deal of difference, because of freedom of the will." Even if the principal characters seem unable to alter their habits and opinions, Voltaire suggests that Candide might change. In the final exchange of the book, the naive hero seems to move cautiously away from the pure optimism of his mentor, Dr. Pangloss. Candide moderates his strict adherence to his master's rigid optimism to include the pragmatic philosophy of cultivating one's garden. The whole little group entered into this laudable scheme. Each one began to exercise his talents. The little plot yielded fine crops. Cunegonde was, to tell the truth, remarkably ugly, but she became an excellent pastry cook. The old woman did the laundry. Everyone did something useful. Pangloss sometimes used to say to Candide, "All events are linked together in the best of possible worlds. For after all, if you had not been driven from a fine castle by being kicked in the backside for love of Miss Cunegonde, if you hadn't been sent before the Inquisition, if you hadn't travelled across America on foot, if you hadn't given a good sword thrust at the Baron, if you hadn't lost all your sheep from the good land of El Dorado, you wouldn't be sitting here eating candied citron and pistachios." "That is very well put," said Candide, "but we must cultivate our garden." Candide makes no effort to refute Pangloss's argument. He simply ignores it. There is, it seems, the possibility that in cultivating, that is, in producing good, rather than merely philosophizing about the good, we might both achieve moderate happiness for ourselves and bring a modicum of benefit to our community. But Voltaire also seems to ask, given the overwhelming evidence of brutality and evil in the world, is this pastoral resolution, available apparently only to the lucky few, a sufficient response to the pervasive reality of evil?